Hello. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Open Infrastructure Summit, and welcome more specifically to the Open Development track, which is a track that Alison and I pushed for to have a space here to discuss open source community management, but also open source in general, not just in the context of open infrastructure. And today, I want to talk to you about why open source is not enough, why open source is necessary, but not sufficient. And I don't want to hold you too long before lunch, and I want to leave time for questions at the end, so I'll jump right in. Free and open source software have a number of key benefits. The first and often most obvious benefit is cost. Access to the source code is basically free. And in a world where software is becoming more and more ubiquitous, the old software pay-per-seat models are no longer as desirable as before. And so cost becomes a very important factor in the decision. But more important to me is availability. The fact that there is no barrier to trying out the software with all of its functionality, that you can simply evaluate the software for future use. You don't have to ask for permission to do it, that you can experiment with it, or just have fun with it. The fact that there is no friction from going from that experimentation to production. Even more important in a corporate setting is sustainability. So when an organization makes the choice of deploying software, it does not want to be left out without maintenance because the software vendor changes its mind or goes bust. And the source code being available, that's annoying, the source code being available for anyone to modify means that you're not relying on a single vendor for long-term maintenance. It also conveniently avoids finding yourself locked in because the cost of changing the software is just too high, and you end up on the vulnerable side of the deal. It's interesting because it's not swapping here, it's just swapping here. Maybe, yes. Nope. That's fine. It's not moving too much. We'll make it work. So you also have this protection against lock-in. That is very interesting. Another key benefit of open source adoption in a corporate setting is that open source makes it easier to identify and attract talent. Enterprises can easily identify potential candidates based on the open record of their contributions to the open source technologies that they are using. Conversely, candidates can easily identify with the open source technologies that an organization is using. So they can join a company with certainty that they will be able to capitalize on the software experience that they will grow there. And if you compare that with proprietary code, where you're not even allowed to share what you're working on, and that you have no chance of encountering in your career ever again. From a technical standpoint, access to the source code means that you can look under the hood and understand by yourself how the software works or why it behaves the way it does. This transparency also allows you to efficiently audit the code for security vulnerabilities, which is an additional benefit. Beyond that, the ability to take and modify the source code means that you have the possibility to find and fix issues by yourself without even depending on a vendor. And finally, with open source, you have the possibility to engage with the community producing the software and to influence its future direction by contributing to it. This gives you extra flexibility to adapt to future needs that you may have. You can make sure that the software will grow the features that you will need tomorrow. And all those benefits really explain why open source won. Open source is everywhere today. Open source has become the de facto standard on how to build and publish software. You can find open source on every server. You can find open source on every phone. Even Microsoft, which is basically the company that invented proprietary software, is heavily adopting open source today. So open source won. But has it really won? I mean, the desktop is still overwhelmingly powered by proprietary software. And if you look at two key tech successes of the past 10 years, Amazon Web Services and Android, they're both using open source under the hood. They're both part of this open source winning story. But if you look at all the benefits that I mentioned earlier, the users of Amazon Web Services or Android don't really have all of them. As an AWS user, you can't really look under the hood and understand how the software works or why it behaves the way it does. As an Android user, you can't really engage with the community producing the software and make sure that it will serve your need better tomorrow, because they don't really accept patches from users. So open source won, and yet, in most cases, users are denied the benefits of open source. The proprietary software model did not die. It just evolved and embraced open source. So it feels like we missed a step. So let's backtrack a bit. Free software started in the 80s by defining freedoms that any free software should grant to its users. Those freedoms basically made you free to take the software, improve it, distribute your changes to the public, and so that everyone benefits. Most projects back then were started by communities, and most users were also contributors. When open source was defined in 1998, it focused on a specific angle, the one that mattered the most to users, which is the rights you get with the software, such as reusability rights or access to the source code. And it's this focus on rights. OK, let's do this. Yes? And it's this focus on rights that made it much more understandable to businesses, and it was key to the success of open source. It's probably coming from my laptop. It's fine. So both free software and open source focused on this, the angle of freedoms and rights that the users get with the software, and that was conveyed by software licenses. They did not mandate anything about how the software should be built. They did not say anything about who ultimately controls the creation of the software. And the reality is, in this century, most open source projects are actually closed one way or another. Their development may be done behind closed doors by a separate group of developers, or their governance may be locked down to ensure permanent control by a specific party. Everyone produces open source software today, but software produced by a really open community has become quite rare. And so today, under the label open source, you can find various things. If you can read this screen that's flipping all the time. You can find single vendor software where the software is controlled by a single company doing development behind closed doors. You can find open core software where the advanced features are reserved for proprietary edition of the software, and the open source version is really used as trial edition. You can find code drops, where an organization will periodically drop the code and open wash it with an open source label. You can also find fire and forget code, where people would just go on GitHub and publish code with no intent of maintaining it. And with those models, you don't get all the benefits of open source software that I mentioned earlier. All these pseudo-open source models are really one way proprietary software evolved in reaction to the success of open source and tried to retain control. But fact is, you can't really have control and community. The control by a specific party over a body of code is discouraging contributors from joining that community. They are seen as free labor, not on a level playing field compared to contributors on the inside who really get to decide the direction of the software. And one solution is to abandon control and embrace community. OpenStack was started with the belief that a community of equals working together in an open collaboration would produce better software. Software that is more aligned to the needs of its users and would be more widely adopted. It was therefore started from day zero as an open collaboration, willing to include as many individuals and organizations as possible, all on a level playing field and involved in designing the solution. And to explain what we meant by this open collaboration, we came up with the 4 opens. There is open source, not open core. There is no provision for features to be reserved for proprietary products. There is open development, the fact that everything that's happening within development is transparent and accessible. One step beyond that, we do open design. Design should not be done behind closed doors by a separate group of elite developers. It should be done in the open and include as many people as possible, especially users. Open community. The idea that our community is a level playing field, that anyone can rise to leadership positions, that there should be no reserved seats for specific organizations, that individual contribution is our only currency. We also believe in a couple of other things beyond those 4 opens. We believe that free software should be built using free tools. If you're using proprietary tools to develop open source software today, you're subject to the limitations and the whims of the proprietary service provider that you're using. And therefore, your software is not really free. We also believe in the central role of QA and continuous integration. We had this saying in the early days of OpenStack that if it's not tested, it's broken. So we place this enormous amount of importance on automated testing. This is the model of collaboration that we've been advocating for at the OpenStack Foundation. And to make it available for more people to try and to other projects, we've been creating OpenDev, which was mentioned in the keynotes this morning. OpenDev is basically an openly operated set of free software tools to sustain open development. We've been basically taking the project infrastructure that we built for OpenStack and making it much more obviously available to other projects under a neutral name. This is not moving anymore. It's fine. I'll survive it. But beyond that, what this really shows is that today, open source is not enough. Open source has basically been abused to produce something that is closer to proprietary software than to the ideals of free software. Something that is denying its users from most of the benefits of open source. So I think it's critical that we come up with a taxonomy, standard words to describe how open source software, open source licensed software is built beyond just the license, so that users can tell the difference and know what the full extent of their benefits using it. Sure. Yeah. Maybe. It's fine. The slides are not essential. They're just pretty pictures to distract the audience. It's more distracting than expected, though. So yeah, the open collaboration model I just described, the one that we promote at the OpenStack Foundation, is just one model. I'm not saying it's perfect or that everyone should adopt it. What I'm saying is that it does guarantee all the benefits of open source that I mentioned earlier. And what I'm saying really is that we need to start caring about how the software is built, and not just the license the code is being released under. Because the benefits you get can be very widely different. OK, let's talk about public clouds now. Because large proprietary public clouds like Amazon Web Services, Google, and Google Cloud and Azure are another way proprietary software evolved in reaction to the success of free software. So there was a lot of discussions lately about how those clouds threaten open source, basically by making open source available in hosted versions on the cloud. And the companies that built a business around open source software like to describe those large public clouds as the enemy, the threat to open source sustainability, because they prevent revenue from going back to the open source vendor and therefore threaten the continued development of that open source project. They're even pushing for a definition of open source, one which would allow them to exclude this unwanted competition. But I'm not very sympathetic to those claims. I think they're based on a flawed assumption that somehow this open source vendor owns the open source project, and therefore bears the responsibility for its continued development, but also should get all the profits derived from it. But by making the initial choice of releasing their software under an open source license, they basically forfeited that ownership. The reality is those vendors really want it both ways. They want the community, all the benefits of open source, but they also want all the benefits derived from that open source software. And open source is not a business model. That might be something that those vendors sold to their VCs, but open source is just describing the freedoms that the users get with the software. So what really happened here is that those companies that were disrupted by open source have adapted, came up with new business models around it, while some other companies stood still. So I don't see large proprietary public clouds as the enemy. I prefer to see them as untapped potential. At first glance, they really appear as the natural enemy of open infrastructure because they run this enormous amount of proprietary code. But if they help building open infrastructure pieces and they deploy them internally, then I think everyone wins. And if you look at what they need from open source, you will see a lot of alignment with the open collaboration model that we've been describing. So public clouds have a lot of open source concerns. They care a lot about sustainability. When they deploy a new service, they basically get ready to maintain it practically forever. And so they make a long-term investment on the software they're deploying. They don't want it to disappear. So they're rightly concerned about the control that some open source software vendors are asserting on their open source software. They much prefer community-controlled projects and openly developed projects. Beyond that, they have unparalleled security challenges. So they need to reduce the attack surface as much as possible. So they're concerned about bloat, about all those features that they don't really use or need, that unnecessarily exposes them. And it's true that it's an area where the open collaboration model I described does not work well for public clouds, because left unchecked, the open collaboration inevitably needs to scope creep. And the reason for that is it's very difficult to say no in an open collaboration. So you end up with all those options, all those plugins, all those features that are slightly beyond your scope as you try to make sure that the software can answer the needs of all those different users. One solution to proactively address that problem is to set a very tight scope from day zero and not deviate from that. But that can be difficult. Another approach is to avoid scope creep is to focus on small reusable pieces. Rather than having the open collaboration focused on building a full product, have them focus on building a framework of small bricks that can be assembled into downstream products. That way, that would make it a lot easier for large proprietary public clouds to engage in open source communities, because then they could build their downstream products with only the features they need out of that framework of bricks. So your nightmare is about to end. In summary, I just want to issue 3 calls to action to reiterate what I said during the talk. First one, open source is not enough. the license the code is released under is not enough. So we should all work on a taxonomy describing free and open source software, focusing on how the software is built, who controls it, how easily you can engage and influence it, so that users can tell the difference and know the full extent of their benefits using the software. Second one is, as open development communities, we should seek to attract participation from those large public clouds vendors, because there is a lot of untapped potential there. There's also a lot of potential alignment with our visions of open source, more than we think. And one way to do that is to focus on reusable pieces, because that will make it a lot easier for them to engage in our open communities. And last but not least, I'm still rooting for open infrastructure. I don't want a world where all of the infrastructure needs are provided by a couple of internet giants. I'm not against Amazon or Google or Microsoft. Like I said, I see a lot of untapped potential, lots of potential alignment with our visions of open source. It's really against the concentration of technology in the hands of the few. And open infrastructure is really a way to enable everyone access to those infrastructure providing technologies. So this is what we will be discussing over the next 3 days. So I hope you have a great time with the Open Infrastructure Summit, and I hope you will all join us, openly developing open infrastructure. Thank you. And we have 20 minutes for questions. I did go fast. It's to avoid epilepsy in the room. And now it's not moving anymore. Questions? Yes. Could you stand up to the mic so that it's recorded?
So you mentioned during your talk that you see, or it's possible that people are seeing these large corporations as the enemy when it comes to open source development. Do you think that has anything to do with like concerns about how like the fruits of labor are being divided?
So I think it's rooted in historical low participation from those organizations into open source projects, more than like a fundamental issue. I feel like if you build the good conditions for them to engage, they're happily engaging. Some of it is public shaming, I guess, because there's been a lot of publicity around this problem, and employees at those various organizations are starting to like change their mind and try to push internally for more openness. We're seeing that happen in Amazon Web Services, for example. So I feel like if you build the right conditions and you actually build something that's useful to them, they would gladly cooperate. But if what you want is extract licensing revenues from those companies, they're not really interested in that. They prefer to, and they prove that they would, fork their version of the software so that they can have like open continued development without needing to pay the open source vendor to get their requirements in. So, like I said, I feel like it's really well aligned with this notion of open collaboration, and I think that we should really seek to attract them more in our open communities, even if by default they look like the natural enemy, especially if you take the OpenStack perspective, where it's like an alternative to public clouds. And so, yeah, I don't think that is that answering the question? Oh, yeah. Thanks.
Hi there. Do you have any thoughts on alternatives for the open core model that has become so popular lately?
I think it's a good question. I think it's the whole model of the open source software vendor that is flawed. I feel like as you engage more directly with users, I mean, a lot of the promise behind open source is that you suppress the barrier between consumers and producers. And I feel like that barrier has been reintroduced in a way by open source vendors, basically say, well, we are producing it and you're consuming it. And as you have those consumers more directly involved with the project, you can have something that's sustainable because everyone using the project is contributing to it. And I feel like if we move away from that model where you are purely producing software and you need to monetize that, I don't think like the licensing model or the open core model is really the right way of doing it. I would rather focus on excellence in the service, integration services, or your own hosting platform than on retaining a number of features for a proprietary edition. Because the problem is it creates a lot of tension. Like where does the line lies? How do you combine the fact that your community might want those features and you as a vendor need to keep them for the proprietary version? It's really difficult. And it's one of the major reasons why OpenStack started. Like it's Eucalyptus was an open core project and NASA wanted to contribute features to make it more scalable. And those features were rejected because they were seen as part of the proprietary product. So NASA basically said, well, I'm leaving this community and I'm forming something else. So it's a very weak model, and I don't think it benefits to the users in the end. So I would rather see a model of like advanced a service model or an open source product model. And I feel like if we focus on reusable pieces, there is this market for downstream products that are built on those reusable pieces rather than have necessarily like a vendor behind every piece of software.
What are good models of civic software development, say city, state, federal level, or international level, that can be used as examples of where the public funded effort, you mentioned Eucalyptus, but others, maybe on smaller scales, what are good current valid models for that we can study, and what are anti-models, I guess you could say, where something produced with public funds is now locked up in proprietary software?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of success with the campaign that the Free Software Foundation in Europe has been waging for basically saying that if software is being developed with public funds, it should be open source software or free software because you basically you use the taxpayer money to build it, and then if it's proprietary, you basically lose. Nobody would. You don't get like long-term benefits from that investment, and I feel like it's been at least in Europe quite popular, and we've seen it in Italy, in France, where they would systematically demand that any software that is developed by the government at any scale should be open source. And I feel like those efforts are probably the best way of convincing lawmakers that it's the right way of doing it, because obviously there is a lot of lobbying, and if you don't have lobbying from the free software advocates on the other side, it's just overwhelmed. And so I feel like this type of advocacy effort is really where the focus should be. And then at every national level, I guess, we've seen platforms for collaboration being formed so that they don't like reinvent the wheel between various ministries or services of the state. And we're seeing it, I think, good progress on that at least in Europe. It's clearly not perfect, but I don't think it's a social model. It's more like a lawmaker environment where you kind of encourage the right thinking and make sure that if the software is being developed using taxpayer money, the taxpayer can actually access it, which is like natural. The way when you say it this way, it feels like normal, but it's clearly not the default way of doing it. Any other question? Well, thank you for suffering through my slide deck, and have a great day.